Hello everyone, and welcome to the RF Museum's Research Lecture Programme. I'm the RF Museum's historian, Dr. Harry Rafal. And before we start tonight, can I welcome all of you from around the world. Tonight we're joined from people from Brisbane, Copenhagen, and even Dewsbury. And wherever you're joining us from, welcome. Tonight's virtual Trenchard Lecture Programme is offered in conjunction with the Royal Aeronautical Society, so many thanks to their support. And we have a great lecture tonight. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, who is Katie Brown. Katie is a doctoral candidate at the University of Akron in Ohio. She earned her undergraduate and master's degrees from Ohio University, and she is a member of the Society for Military History and the Second World War Research Group. Katie's research focuses on the history of the RAF in the first half of the 20th century, and today she's going to present research from her dissertation. So Katie, I'm going to bring you back onto the screen. Okay, perfect, it's worked. So take it away.
All right. Good afternoon from middle of America, or good evening to those in the UK. My lecture today is going to be looking at some particular of my favorite passages, I guess, from my dissertation, looking at gendered language in the debates for and against strategic bombing from about 1930s through the Second World War. Go ahead and change slides, please. Before we get started into actually looking at the language used, I kind of wanted to look at what is gendered language. Myself, when I first started graduate school, when I heard gendered history, I automatically assumed women's history. I quickly learned that that is mistaken. Gendered history can encompass a whole bunch of different aspects, and it actually is quite interesting to look at when you're studying war. So one recurrent theme that the individuals in this debate, and I do separate them into two groups: the pacifists, obviously those who hope to outlaw war, argue for aerial restriction throughout, and then the militarists, and those are the individuals who supported the continued supply of British defenses. I know militarists can have a negative connotation, particularly when you're thinking of Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. In this instance, that negative connotation, I'm kind of pushing that aside. But one recurrent theme that these individuals on both sides often invoked was this concept of chivalry. Chivalry was and is not a universally inherent notion, however. So the definition that I use is what given by historian Mark Gerard. He argued that throughout the 19th century, influential authors such as Sir Walter Scott and Thomas Carlyle deliberately created this chivalric ideal as a way to produce a ruling class which deserved to rule because it possessed the moral qualities necessary to rulers. Victorian institutions such as the public school system also helped to develop and spread the newly adapted chivalric code. This idea that gentlemen must be brave, show no signs of panic or cowardice, be courteous and protective to women and children, be loyal to their comrades, and meet their death without flinching. And this spread particularly through the privileged and middle classes. Consequently, in Victorian Britain, the ideal man or the ideal gentleman became synonymous with the medieval knights of the Arthurian legend. Another historian, Graham Dawson, has noted a real man would henceforth be defined and recognized as one who was prepared to fight and, if necessary, sacrifice his life for queen, country, and empire. And even after the horrors of the First World War, most believed that war was supposed to be fought in this gentlemanly manner. Men in uniform were supposed to be patriotic, chivalrous, and above all honorable. And the advent of air power simultaneously reaffirmed and threatened that ideal. Historian George Mossey posits that the fighter pilot conjured up memories of knightly combat, of a more civilized kind of warfare, which was absent in the trenches. More so, he argues the Knights of the Sky were both a new race of men in their flying machines, and at the same time were thought to embody the traditions of male honor and chivalry. Yet, as witnessed in the First World War, the Zeppelin and Gotha raids highlighted that airplanes also allowed an enemy to attack innocent civilians, women and children in particular, at the heart of a nation. Therefore, it was up to the chivalrous pilots, to protect the nation's innocence. And I will say, studying gendered language, though, is more than just analyzing the use of certain words like chivalry and honor, women and children. What is more important is the tone and feeling that the author or speaker is trying to portray to the reader or listener by using specific words. One historian has noted that language frames memory and that words carry particular stories with them, and they can therefore evoke certain socially constructed or remembered images. The use of specific words such as chivalry and honor simultaneously crafted the nation's memory of the recent past while reinforcing preconceived ideas of British legitimacy and German inferiority. And by repeatedly mentioning the Germans' barbarous nature in a speech, pamphlet, or article, militarists and pacifists could immediately transport the reader or listener back to the First World War Zeppelin or Gotha raids and recall the fear and confusion surrounding those events. Also, you see with gendered rhetoric, evoking this idea of the culturally constructed separate sphere or dual spheres. Women and children, and even the elderly, were meant to inhabit the domestic space, where women were in charge of running and maintaining the household, raising and educating the children, and overseeing religious instruction, while men inhabited the public sphere, going to work, politics, war, that sort of thing. During the Victorian era, especially, you see members of the British and even American society viewing the outside public world to be overly political, rough and dirty, and generally unsafe for the weaker female sexes. The German raids on London in the First World War threatened to dismantle the two-sphere system by bringing the battlefront at home. Therefore, it became imperative that during war and peacetime, the supposedly stronger, less emotional male population became the protector of the remaining feminized women, children, elderly population at home. Historians also conclude that the culturally constructed idea of separate spheres naturally expanded in wartime, with the public sphere becoming the battlefront while the private sphere became the home front. Even before the dawn of the 20th century, men were supposed to leave the house to go to work or fight on pitched fields of battle, while their wives, girlfriends, fiancés, and or daughters stayed home and tended to the household. This belief in the martial male, the peaceable female, only grew during the Victorian era and even into World War I. And as a result, the nation itself came to be conceived as a gendered entity, the feminized civilian society needing protection from the masculinized soldier hero. And so in Great Britain throughout the interwar years, the master narrative of the First World War continually painted women as the innocents at home and men as the warriors at the front. It therefore became imperative for interwar militarists and pacifists to exploit this narrative in their argument for and against strategic bombing. In other words, you will see, and I saw throughout my research and throughout this slideshow, you will see this kind of the men, the pilots of the Air Force need to protect this feminized home front. I would like to, as a side note, mention that while I am primarily focusing on a dichotomy between the chivalrous male and the innocent female, it's important to note that gendered history it encompasses more than just a study of women vis-a-vis men. Historians throughout have shown that incorporating the historical constructs of manliness and this masculine ideology is essential to understand the history of empire, race relations, foreign relations, and particularly war. Studying gender, you can get a better understanding of the power dynamics between the stronger and weaker, the enemies, empire, and that sort of thing. All right, so skipping over, or moving past rather, this kind of definition of what I am looking for, let's look at some examples. You can go ahead and switch slides. And historians have traditionally pointed to the First World War as a catalyst for change in a variety of ways, most notably in society and military culture. The new strategies and tactics introduced by both sides during the First World War forever changed politicians' and military strategists' mindsets about how to plan for future wars. The introduction of the airplane meant that wars could now be fought in 3 different environments: land, sea, and air. And as I had mentioned previously, the Zeppelin and Gotha raids of the First World War further drove home the realization that civilians, especially the nation's women and children on the newly established home front, would never again be safe from enemy attack. And where my research started and most historians come back to is this famous quote here by Stanley Baldwin. In fact, my master's degree was or my master's thesis, was titled "The Bomber Will Always Get Through." And they look at this when discussing the acceptance of strategic bombing in the interwar years. And while it's often important to understand how contemporary sentiments influenced the varying offensive and defensive strategies developed in the interwar years, this presentation, my dissertation, is more concerned with the latter part of the quotation, the second one I have up there. Baldwin continued his speech proclaiming that the only defense is an offense, which means that you have to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy if you want to save yourselves. This phrase draws almost a visceral reaction from the reader or the listener, playing on the idea that women, and especially children, are pure innocents and that any deliberate attack is unthinkable. Surprisingly to many, Baldwin originally made this statement as a call for universal disarmament rather than a rallying cry to strengthen the RAF. Pacifists in the general public in the 1920s and 30s would use the same tactic to press their agendas, incorporating gendered language to call forth the nation's men to protect the women and children of Britain, and something that is usually called for during war. The men and women need to protect, the men need to protect the women and children. Traditionally, notions of peace were believed to reside in the women's realm, this domestic sphere. So traditional men were seen, pacifistic men were viewed as effeminate. If you know anything about the White Feather Campaign during the First World War, for example, that's the big example of this feminizing women or men. By invoking this standard patriarchal martial ideal of protecting Britain's civilian population, as well as the sanctity of the civilian combatant divide, Britain's interwar pacifists used gendered language to masculinize and therefore legitimize the peace movement. Their arguments reversed the traditional gender roles, implying that pacifism was in fact manly because it was the man's responsibility to save Britain through peace rather than brute force. And so the first couple examples here focus mostly on these pacifistic arguments. Next slide, please. You also see women were called upon to do their part to persuade for peace. In the 1920s and 1930s, particularly one of the most outspoken was this woman here, Vera Brittain. In the conclusion to her essay, "Can the Women of the World Stop War?" Brittain proclaimed, "I refuse to believe that women who produce life, will permit mankind resignedly to accept death from the diabolical instruments of its own invention. By incorporating this persuasive statement, Britain calls upon British women, the mothers of the country, to show the policymakers the way to bring an end to war. Britain contends that peace could be just as gallant as war, just as heroic, and it is the women's job to ultimately masculinize, thus legitimize pacifist sentiment. Notably, the insertion of the line "who produce life" conjures up a maternal image. It was the woman's motherly duty to do everything that she could, even lobbying Parliament to protect her children. Therefore, by preemptively outlawing war, a woman could guarantee that her children were safe from potential indiscriminate attacks or military service. Unfortunately for Britain, Vera Brittain, the irony behind her argument that peace is more effeminate and therefore not a legitimate course of action is that women themselves, whether pacifist or militarist, resigned themselves in believing that they are unable to change society based on historical precedent. Societal tropes influenced women into believing that their genetic disposition inherently meant that they are the weaker sex and less likely to be influencers of policy and or public opinion. And this was ultimately more dangerous for civilization than the continued reliance on military institutions. So she, in a different essay, she argued, so long as they, meaning British women, accept the idea that childbearing is a physiological handicap from which women are unfortunate enough to suffer, instead of a privileged service to the community, we shall continue to blow away our revenge on guns and bombardments instead of using it to endow and improve the difficult beginnings of human existence. So once again, you see Vera Brittain invoking the maternal image and the necessity of protecting the nation's youngest members. She's once again calling upon women to take up this quest for peace. And as long as I have time, we will actually come back to Britain during the end of the Second World War, and you see a similarity in her arguments there. Next slide, please. You do see, though, by 1935, British national and military strategy beginning to shift, particularly in response to Adolf Hitler's renunciation of the League of Nations and unveiling that they had, in fact, developed the Luftwaffe. So you see interwar policies in Britain shifting in favor of a sustained military buildup to achieve parity with Germany's forces. This situation only hardened pacifists' resolve to demonstrate the dire need for disarmament and peace, however. This man here, Aldous Huxley, in his 1937 work, An Encyclopedia of Pacifism, Huxley argues against this romantic vision of warfare. He concluded that chivalry has disappeared and the rules of war are coming to be ignored. In any future war, force will probably mean violence and fraud used to the extreme limit of the belligerent's capacity. Instead, the pacifist who seeks to remove war from the world carries out the true chivalrous act. For Huxley, pacifism relies on a moral courage, self-control, and knowledge, and to use these means is often extraordinarily hard, but history shows that it can be done, and done not only by exceptional individuals, but by large groups of ordinary men and women, and even the government. Once again, he is bringing this idea of the chivalrous male is the one who ends war altogether rather than fights to protect the nation during war. Next slide, please. You see, and I didn't have any pictures for this one, so it's a bunch of words. I apologize for that. But pacifists in Parliament continued to fight for the end of aerial warfare, even after the failure of various, particularly the League of Nations meetings, and to end warfare. And you see these two come from the air estimates debate in 1937. Frederick Watkins, who was a Labor MP for Hackney Central, described why it was necessary to abolish air forces. He postulated that in the next war, there will be no distinction between soldiers and sailors and mothers and children in the homes. Up to now, war has been a kind of gentlemanly business, with a declaration of war going in front of it, a kind of referee's whistle to indicate that the match is set to start. War in the future will start suddenly, and hysterical men, women, and children, the civilians in the street, will be subjected to all the horrors. So once again, you see this idea, and this is actually where I got my title for this talk and my dissertation. Is aerial warfare an end to this gentlemanly business here? And Watkins used this cataclysmic description of aerial warfare to show that the only salvation for humanity was to bring an end to warfare altogether. By attempting to legislate Britain's continual attempt to abolish military aviation, Watkins and the Labour Party tried to ensure Britain's role as the protector of the wider world. They saw it as Britain's duty to enforce global peace. Others, such as Charles Brown, another Labour MP, this time for Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, referred to the similar ideas in their arguments, or in his arguments as well. Brown, in reference to potential aerial reprisals, he argued, even if we start off with the intention of not using our bombers for the destruction of cities and the lives of women and children, does not the whole history of war point to the fact that we would be forced by the course of events and by the logic of circumstances to retaliate against an enemy who bombed us by bombing in return his cities and his civilian population? Merely having what I may describe as the ideals of how war should be waged will not avoid that contingency. And interestingly, in both of these passages, both Brown and Watkins consider the enemy's population in their arguments. British women and children were not the only innocents in danger. Embedded in their arguments was the idea that the British, not just a theoretical enemy, could actually become barbarians if they pursued warfare, specifically aerial warfare. Thus, for these pacifists in Parliament, it was imperative for global civilization and Britain's global image that the British lead others in abolishing aerial warfare. And while their arguments did not really hold sway in Parliament, you do see the language and these arguments are worthy of additional analysis. Next slide, please. And so we'll kind of shift away from the more pacifist arguments to those that favored military buildup. And so you do see some influence by the pacifist arguments in the interwar years. Government officials were not completely blind to the international situation. Once again, they knew Hitler was rearming. And by the middle of 1934, Parliament did consider adopting a policy of rearmament in lieu of diplomatic limitations on war. Many MPs believed that the government's focus on pacifistic ideology failed to protect the British. Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Roger Keyes, the man here pictured on the left, found that the lack of governmental support for the RAF endangered the general population, but also the quote-unquote Knights of the Air. He passionately argued, "I have unbounded faith in our chivalrous young airmen, but it simply is not fair to ask them to fight against overwhelming odds. If this country is attacked, and once again they are called upon to retaliate by attacking the root of evil." He continued that the best guarantee for the maintenance of peace with countries within aerial reach of England is by providing an efficient and adequate air force. Therefore, it would be unsporting to expect the chivalrous knights of the air to be the first line of defense in protecting the nation, while simultaneously withholding the best armor and equipment needed for their protection. You do see some questioning that the RAF could even protect against air attack if the bomber would inevitably get through. Spending money on building up the Air Force seemed to be a waste of resources. In response, Conservative MP for Swindon, Sir Reginald Banks, likened the enemy bomber to an annoying wasp. He concluded, "It is extremely difficult to swat the individual wasp. What does the sensible person do? He destroys the wasp's nest. In other words, strike at the enemy's aerodrome, but we cannot strike if we have not got an adequate force." For Keyes, Banks, and others, by not supporting aerial rearmament, the interwar governments did the opposite of what they set out to do. Instead of protecting civilization through peace, the government jeopardized precious military and civilian lives. Parliament at this point was not fully swayed. Only 60 members out of 464 voted for rearmament. But you do see arguments such as this continue throughout the interwar years. Next slide, please. And it wasn't just Parliament who was arguing for rearmament. You often see militarists citing historical examples of aerial bombardment. Former RAF Chief Staff Officer in Iraq, Air Commodore L.E.O. Charlton, in his works War Over England and the Next War, written in 1936 and then 1937, offered the reader a short, apocalyptic description of what could happen in the next war should Britain not be prepared to strike the first blow. In the preface to The Next War, he reminded the reader of the damage the Gotha raids caused in 1917. He explains that the air raids designedly struck at the heart of our people, who thereby learned the lesson that cruel school that henceforth the civilian, whatever might be the age, sex, or condition, stood in the ranks of slaughter co-equally with the soldier at the front. He went on to argue that the children were as frequently the sufferers as grown-ups, for the slaughter was indiscriminate. He further lamented that there was a great invisible loss as well. In hospital wards, babies were born deaf, deformed, and blind, owing to the terrorization of expectant mothers. Obviously, we know now that that's not necessarily the case for birth defects, but it was, for Charlton at least, the British man's duty to do everything in his power to protect his family. And his stirring account was a call to Britain's women as well, bringing in this idea that you need to protect your children, the recollection that children were not safe, even in the womb, advised women that a strong air force was necessary to maintain life, both literal life and then the life of the country. Next slide, please. Additionally, you see this tactics employed by the RAF to police the empire in the 1920s proved to many that the efficacy of a strong air force, and they continued to resonate with militarists in the government throughout the 1930s. Militarists continued to incorporate gendered language and popular tropes in their argument that a strong offensive bomber force was vital for national security. In his 1935 essay, Policing the Empire, former officer of the RAF, Air Commodore J.A. Chamier, criticized the pacifistic arguments from those with little knowledge who criticize air action in the periphery, and speak of the bombing of women and children and the indiscriminate slaughter. Instead, he argued aerial policing in the Middle East, and therefore strategic bombing in any future war, was in the highest degree humane, since sufficient notice was given for women and children to be removed to safety. He predominantly wrote his essay as a defense for air rearmament in the wake of the failed Geneva Disarmament Conference, and he therefore concluded that even when we leave the marches of the empire, where local unrest is endemic and considered other problems which face us, we find many cases where the advent of the airplane operates to lessen our troubles. In other words, when war once again returns to the more civilized countries in Europe, it would be of vital importance for Britain to have a strong air force capable of bombing the enemy. And his ideas were followed by MP Austin Hopkins. He was an independent MP for modern-day Greater Manchester, and he later argued that opponents must dismiss from their minds the idea that a bombing airplane under the control of the people of this country is necessarily a device for tormenting women and children in foreign countries. It has functions much more reputable and much more manly. So, for Chamure and Hopkins and others, it was clear that only a strong, respectable, manly bombing force could protect Britain's civilians. And so building up a strong force and projecting Britain's global preponderance would pose as a deterrent for future war. Next slide, please. Within a year, however, the arguments for and against air were nullified. By 1939, the situation was grim. An international air pact never came to fruition. The British government began an intensive overhaul of their air raid precautions, and Adolf Hitler and his commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, continued to build up air forces. It soon became clear that Britain could not protect the world from the outbreak of another war, so instead the government opted for military buildup in the hopes that they would be prepared when the war came. The British pacifist and the Labour government's first push for a peaceful end to aerial bombardment did not save the innocent Polish women and children cut down by Luftwaffe bombs, nor did it save the British Army from being attacked by the Luftwaffe as they retreated from Dunkirk back across the English Channel in 1940. So by September 1939, war was here, and arguments for or against air power ceased to matter. The time was now to use it. And so you see, upon the outbreak of hostilities on the 1st of September 1939, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent a plea to Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Poland, asking them to refrain from indiscriminately bombing civilians during the war. The belligerent governments all pledged that they would refrain from indiscriminate attacks on the enemy's civilian populations. Even Adolf Hitler assured President Roosevelt that, quote, German air fighting forces have received a command to limit themselves to military objects in their combative actions. The British government, for its part, adhered to the promise of President Roosevelt at first. Instead of devastating Berlin with a swift knockout blow, in the early months, British bombers rained leaflets down on Nazi Germany's cities. It was only after the Germans overran the Low Countries that the RAF began bombarding military targets. More importantly, however, was Britain's reputation on the global stage. In the early stages of the war cabinet was fearful of international scrutiny, and so the RAF, the champion of the civilian, could not equal the German barbarity. Consequently, British military officials waited for Goering and the Luftwaffe to make the first move against British civilian targets. And so as a result, Bomber Command's efforts in the early years of the war were often considered to be failures. Not only did Bomber Command fail to strike a knockout blow against the German capital, but the stories of Fighter Command's epic battles against the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz tend to overshadow Bomber Command's scattered raids on German naval installations during the early years or months of the Battle of Britain. And fearing international condemnation and a tarnished chivalric image, politicians in the Air Ministry were hesitant to unleash the bomber's full potential. The appointment of Arthur Harris as Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command in February 1942 appeared to be the catalyst needed to change British aerial policy. However, it actually was 1 week before Harris was promoted to Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief that the RAF officially abandoned precision bombing and adapted area bombing, with the official order Directive Number 22 of 14th of February 1942 stated that the RAF should focus attacks on the morale of the enemy's civil population and, in particular, the industrial workers. Next slide, please. So now we'll look at kind of some of the arguments during the later years of the war about strategic bombing. For members in the Air Ministry and the government, the adoption of area bombing did not lessen Britain's moral high ground. The Air Ministry continued to maintain Britain's chivalric image by denying any such claims. They saw the way of preventing any potential outcry over the new policy was to assure the public that the RAF continued to attack military, not civilian targets, even under intense scrutiny. And there are many examples of parliamentary questions and debates asking Air Ministry officials if they are in fact bombing military targets. Moreover, government officials made sure to stress that while they were not retaliating against German bombing attacks, they were reacting to them. For example, the first quote here, Winston Churchill, in an address to the Canadian Parliament's House of Commons, argued, "We have not asked that the rules of the game should be modified. We shall never descend to the German level, but if anybody likes to play rough, we can play rough too. Hitler and his Nazi gang have sown the wind. Let them reap the whirlwind." And you see over and over this idea of this whirlwind now has been unleashed because of the Germans. For Churchill, war was like a schoolyard sporting match. If the opponent chose to play rough, then by golly, the home team should as well. And Churchill was not the only one to favor an escalation of policy. In fact, during the Blitz, you see in response to the razing of London, many Britons experienced anger, and a small majority even expressed a desire for revenge, calling for reprisals against German cities. Notably, throughout September and October 1940, London's Daily Mail received hundreds of letters demanding ruthless reprisals on German cities for the air attack on London. On the 25th of September, for example, the editor of the It's Your Opinion column acknowledged that the subject, i.e. reprisals, has produced a bigger outpouring of public opinion than any similar topic since the war began, with most echoing the sentiments of Mr. Fred H. Woods of London, who believed the RAF should bomb the hearts out of Berlin. And further examination of some of the printed letters show the quick reversal of interwar concerns for specific targets and the protection of innocent lives. The most surprising letter that I saw came from Rosa Kehoe of North London, who asked, "Why all this tender feeling for German children? This is war and we are all in it." For a female reader to express apathy toward children, even if they were German children, went against a woman's supposed maternal instinct, the same instinct that we saw Vera Brittain and others invoke in the interwar years in their quest for peace. So that one particularly stood out as kind of an opposing idea of what women were supposed to believe or feel. Some members of Parliament praised and even supported a further increase in Bomber Command's raids. One member specifically praised the attacks on German war manufacturing when he declared, "If our bombing force goes to Germany and destroys the nests from which these destructive insects, German airplanes, come, that is of much more importance and is much more desirable than waiting until the bombs drop before we help our people." There is no logical difference between rescuing a child from the gutter after it has been bombed and destroying the nests from where the bombers come. If you stop production in Germany, you will render her impotent when our men land on her own or German-occupied territory. Once again, an argument similar to one that we have already looked at, referring to the enemy as insects. Despite the escalation of British bombing, Bomber Command continued to be the honorable force, even refraining from too ruthless or concentrated attacks. Moreover, MP's arguments are quite similar to militarist arguments advocating aerial policing and other arguments that developed throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. By castrating German war production, Bomber Command could assure the livelihood of Britain's populace. Furthermore, by preemptively destroying the German insects, quote unquote, in their nests, the government would not have to amass the additional expenses after the destruction of British cities. Thus, the RAF appeared to be the chivalrous knight protecting the British homeland and thwarting the enemy advances by attacking those targets that hindered Germany's war-making abilities. Next slide, please. One tactic several Air Ministry officials used to downplay Bomber Command's attacks on civilians and to defend Britain's moral superiority was to shift the blame for the quote-unquote accidental bombings of German civilians on the Germans themselves. For example, in the House of Commons, the Undersecretary of State for Air, Captain Harold Balfour, argued, if in our pursuit of our objective, the German civilian population has to suffer, it is not our fault. It is not for us to turn back because of that. The remedy lies in the hands of the German people themselves. For Balfour, the Nazi government should do the honorable thing and save their civilian population by surrendering. Arthur Woodburn, Labour MP for Clackmannan and East Stirlingshire, took the argument that war was Germany's fault one step further when in 1944 he argued, I do not consider that we are making war at all. We and the rest of the civilized world are resisting and destroying the war makers. We are preventing them from making war. Therefore, our bombing is a hygienic and sanitary operation and is not a military operation in the aggressive sense at all. While I feel sympathy with anyone who is within the range of falling bombs, we must realize that there is no doubt that the German population are still behind Hitler and the German generals. Until that state of affairs ceases to exist, they must accept some responsibility for war making. Once again, Woodburn emphasized that the British were not to blame. They were only resisting or reacting to German aggression. Next slide, please. This image is probably familiar to many. Arthur Harris also blamed the Germans for starting the war and the RAF's bombing policy in a pamphlet which was dropped over Germany in mid-1942. After initially stating that the RAF raids were not conducted in revenge, he asserted that the British do not forget Warsaw, Belgrade, Rotterdam, London, Plymouth, or Coventry. We are bombing you and your cities one by one and ever more terribly in order to make it impossible for you to go on with the war. For Harris, it was Adolf Hitler and the Luftwaffe who instigated the brutality of war. It was therefore justifiable that the RAF paid them back in kind. Moreover, the pamphlet reaffirmed the idea that Bomber Command still only focused on military targets. Matter-of-factly, the pamphlet went on to argue, obviously, we prefer to hit your factories, shipyards, and railways. It damages your government's war machine most. But nearly all these targets are in the midst of the houses of those of you who work in them. Therefore, we hit your houses and you when we bomb them. We regret the necessity for this, but this regret will never stop us. You showed the world how to do it. It is true that it is terrible that the women and children suffering from the bombing. But why does not your government evacuate all the women and children from the industrial towns which we are bombing? This is what the British government did. Why does not the Nazi government save your women and children in the same way? Therefore, Harris is showing that any collateral damage resulting from a bombing raid was the German government's fault. The German government not only failed to protect Germany's civilians by allowing for houses to be built near industrial sites. I don't know how they could have prevented that. But more importantly, they did not establish proper air raid precautions or evacuation protocol like the superior British did. Regrettably, if you're familiar with policy, particularly the Cherwell Memorandum, Harris's pamphlet was a bold-faced lie. The British were specifically targeting industrial cities and industries workers. Next slide, please. And I don't think I'll have time to get through all of my examples. We'll look for the next 5 minutes or so at a couple of those who were not enchanted by Bomber Command's amplified policy. As early as January 1941, prominent pacifist organization, the Peace Pledge Union, distributed a pamphlet warning that no nation can carry out a policy of indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children without damaging, if not destroying, the ideals in whose name the slaughter is done. At the beginning of February 1944, the Bishop of Chichester, George Bell, admonished Britain's bombing policy in the House of Lords. He concluded that the terrific devastation by Bomber Command of German towns was in fact illegal. More important for Bell was the ethical implications of aerial bombing. Questioning the official description of Bell admonished, how can there be discrimination in such matters when civilians, monuments, military objects, and industrial objectives altogether form the target? Thus, he believed that the bombing raids on Hamburg and Berlin, in particular, had gone too far and were, in fact, indiscriminate. Next slide. Baron Cosmo Lang of Lambeth, former Archbishop of Canterbury, agreed with Bishop Bell's assessment of the illegality and unscrupulous nature of Britain's bombing policy. And he also took Bell's argument one step further by questioning what an indiscriminate bombing policy meant for Britain's morality as a nation. He cautioned it is one thing to accept the destruction of military objectives and of their immediate neighborhood as a regrettable military necessity. It is quite another thing to exult in it, to gloat over it, and to regard it as something that in itself worthy of almost jubilant congratulations. By turning a blind eye to Bomber Command's dalliance with indiscriminate bombing, for Lang, the average Briton risked sliding into moral delinquency and barbarism. He also saw the frequent calls for retaliation against Germany, adding to the potential moral deterioration of the British people. He asserted in the ruthlessness in which retaliation exalts and for which it clamors must bring us into competition with our enemy at his worst. It must mean that somehow or another we become indifferent to those values of humane civilization for which, as people, we have believed we are contending in this war. That sort of competition is one we should all agree in which success would be far more dishonorable than defeat. So for Lang, by returning Germany's barbaric attacks in kind, the British risked turning into the very villains that they had lambasted for 5 years. And for Lang, at least, that would be much more dishonorable and horrific than losing the war. You also, and this will be the last one we'll look at, comments and debates against Britain's strategic bombing policy occurred in the House of Commons as well. We'll end with this slide. Labour MP for Ipswich, Richard Stokes, was one of the most outspoken critics of strategic bombing throughout the war. He regularly questioned the Air Ministry and other government officials about the military nature of their chosen targets, and he did not believe the government's assertions that all the raids were conducted on justified military targets. He saw the escalation of Britain's bomber war meant that the RAF was engaging in indiscriminate bombing raids, and in the 1943 air estimates debate, he protested in the name of humanity that we should, with such cold-bloodedness, both talk of and engage in the perfectly merciless destruction and slaughter of the women and children of other nations. Even though they may be our enemies, Stokes' lament, like the countless gendered appeals made in the interwar years, used the image of the innocent women and child, helpless under the weight of the bombs, to bring a sense of urgency to his argument. What stands out, however, is Stokes's consideration for the enemy women and children. While others had argued that Britain must end bombing to prevent innocent deaths, they always used generic terms such as civilians or population to describe the Germans. And now we see someone acknowledging the humanity of the enemy. Bombs are falling on German women and children, not just soldiers. By adding specific genders and ages to the enemy, Stokes rehumanized the enemy. Particularly after years of dehumanizing propaganda and war, he provided the enemy with a face, a purpose, and a place in society. And obviously you will see arguments against strategic bombing continue to grow, particularly in the wake of the Dresden attacks in early 1945. So.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Katie. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to just minimize these slides now. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I was struck by several points, and it made me think in particular about Churchill's histories of the Second World War, because he makes a great point. I'm going to close these slides. He makes a great point very early on in the first volume about talking about this move towards pacifism in Britain in the sort of 1920s and 30s. He mentions East Fulham as the last constituency to vote a pacifist government, to vote a pacifist member of parliament into parliament, and that's in the 1930s. You know, he goes into great length into exploring this issue. So I wonder what is the wider significance of this move towards gendered pacifism within British society as well, and how does that seep through into the post-war period?
I guess the wider importance is that you see this shift in pacifism, where pacifism is becoming legitimized. Before, it was kind of this offshoot, and you see arguments against war becoming more and more prominent. I haven't done much research past the Second World War, but I would, at least from the American perspective, see how this change of the anti-war movement, particularly with Vietnam and in the Cold War era, became much more outspoken and mainstream. So I would see how that continued to grow, the importance.
Okay, great. We've got plenty of time for questions, which is great. Spud says here, would it be fair to say that the concept of strategic bombing created the total war concept involving the total population of warring nations, or would you flip that on its head?
There's a lot of historiographical debate as to when total war started. What was that? If you ask a United States Civil War historian, for example, they will argue that total war started in the 1800s. I think what I have seen is these arguments and debates are growing on that idea of total war. I see, particularly in Britain, because they had been separated by the North Sea, and they had this insularity particularly after the First World War, this idea that, oh yes, war is total, is coming. So I wouldn't say strategic bombing created total. I would say they developed, at least in Britain, going off of each other, if that makes sense.
So there's a question here from Juliet Ball, who asks about the Pathfinder Force, which was formed in 1942, and the need to ensure precision bombing. I think I'd also like to sort of tie in the US Army Air Force here and its drive towards precision bombing. How much of these arguments around precision rooted in sort of similar concepts about sort of masculinity and pacifism, or are they devoid of that?
And I didn't really get into the use many examples showing this, but in particularly in the development of these arguments, the focus is on precision bombing. Precision bombing is what makes us more manly. We are going to focus on these exact specific military targets. We aren't going to be like the Germans in the First World War and just bomb London. But as you get into the war, 1941, 42, you see that is not, they can't do that. It's not effective. You have the Butt report coming out and saying that their early policies are once again ineffective. So you see more so a change in rhetoric to justify the change in policy to area bombing, carpet bombing over precision bombing. With the United States and the Army Air Force, they would continue throughout the war to focus on precision bombing because they had the Norden bomb site. They thought they were more, that would help them maintain this precision attack. They tended to focus on daylight raids rather than the night raids that Bomber Command was using. And so they continue to see their policy, I guess, as superior, but you don't really see, and I haven't delved in a lot to the American rhetoric and literature, but from what I have seen, the Americans are arguing that their policy is the more honorable one, downplaying. But it's just this shift in rhetoric on how they are describing what is going on, how they're justifying what's going on.
I'd like to pick up on a comment that Chris has made on the side around the use of propaganda material, whether or not it fits into the sort of primary source around the other narrative you provided. I thought it was a really interesting extract you provided from Harris, and that use of saying, why doesn't the German government protect its women and children the way that the British government has? In a way, almost exerting a more masculine Britain over sort of Germany.
Right. Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. Whether or not that was deliberate, I don't know. Have you seen any sort of counter examples from the German discussion of bombing which sort of plays into this?
Unfortunately, I do not read German, so I have not gotten to go a lot into German sources, but I have seen some excerpts, some translated excerpts, and you actually see in one, there was a police sergeant in, I believe it was in Hamburg, in response to the Hamburg attack, that you see a very similar, the people coming together very much like the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. So you see this police sergeant reporting to the government this gung-ho, we're going to get through this mentality. Yes, I've seen some. I haven't seen a whole lot, I guess.
It'd be interesting to see how Goebbels talks about it in his diaries.
Yeah, that that's one area I would like to expand on for in the future.
Okay, great. So to our audience, if you have more questions, do keep them coming. So we've got one from Dr. Anthony Gee. He says, for years, bomb delivery by one side placed reliance upon compass and drift calculations, while the other employed electronic guidance, so to 500 meters and 500 kilometers. did gentlemanly chivalry figure into the underlying reasons for this difference in precision?
I don't think so. Mostly, once again, it was they used chivalry to describe, and this gentlemanly image to describe mostly to the populace what they were doing. It did not focus a lot on specific strategic or tactical issues. I saw it most as a way to describe for the public, pretty much.
I think it's quite interesting the way that the RAF conceives of the strategic bombing offensive. A lot of it does seem to be almost propaganda to sell air power, doesn't it? And so again, does that play into how it's discussed and how pacifists then choose to discuss it?
Yeah, and you actually see in some of Harris's papers himself, he wanted to tell the public, hey, we are bombing, we're focusing on industrial workers, we are focusing on this particular thing. The Air Ministry would not let him. It was, no, we have to keep up this chivalrous image. We are not the bad guys. And so obviously Harris was outweighed and they could not do it. But you do, it all goes back to language and rhetoric and how they're justifying doing one thing over the other.
I think that there's a question here from Jeffrey, which raises a really interesting point to get into. So you've mentioned Dresden, of course. He points out that obviously the damage pales into insignificance when we compare it to, say, the Holocaust. I think is absolutely right. I don't think anyone here wants to disagree with that. I think it's very interesting to know, how did that then play into the arguments people were making against strategic bombing? Were they aware of the damage which was happening within Germany and the destruction that the Nazi government was producing? And how did those sort of fit together?
You really start to see, well, I'll focus on Dresden first, and then we'll get into the post-war. With the publication, newspapers coming out, what had happened in Dresden, you start to see a number of former proponents of strategic bombing kind of shying away. Probably the most famous being Winston Churchill. He's kind of backing up, sending out memos saying, maybe we went a bit too far there. Maybe we should back away from strategic bombing. In the public, you start to see particularly Vera Brittain once again speaking out against strategic bombing. And they acknowledge that the Germans were, the Nazi government, for example, was they were barbarians, but they don't really focus on the Holocaust, and that in the after the war, in rhetoric and discussions there, it's really, I mean, Germany is the stereotypical bad guy, Nazi Germany, because of how they fought the war, because of the Holocaust. So you see when going back in discussions, arguing, was strategic bombing worth it? Was it the ethical? Was it the moral policy? So you have to weigh on one hand, one or the other. But you don't see a lot during the war talking about the Holocaust versus strategic bombing.
Okay. So again, to audience, do put in the questions using the ask a question function. I thought it was a really interesting point right at the start of your talk, Katie, where you quoted Vera Lynn and this idea of producing life. And it made me think of the way that women go into the manufacturing industries, which of course sort of runs counter, we're linking into this total war argument again, it runs counter to what the pacifists were perhaps thinking about, but also the way that proponents of strategic bombing did talk about a knockout blow, and so perhaps there wasn't that expectation. But the thing that really fascinated me was wondering how these concepts filtered in to the service itself, the RAF, And when air crews went to visit the factories, as they often did, in particular in the case of Avro with the Lancaster, so a lot of women were involved in production. And again, this idea of producing life. Did that concept of gender come into how they interacted when they came together? Have you seen anything about that?
I have not looked much into that, but I would imagine so. I mean, war, especially total war, is breaking down these separate spheres, but also reifying them at the same time with rhetoric. But I mean, you see, as with women producing the armaments that are sending these knights of the air out, it is interesting. It's something to look into. I have not done a lot into that.
Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating because, again, it links into that point you made about the breaking down of the dual spheres. And, I suppose, was there a desire to gender the talk of pacifism coming from societal influences, wanting to put women into that domestic sphere and keep them there? And again, looking post-war, how does that change in relation to women increasingly entering the workplace?
The traditional argument is that it did, in fact, break down this. Women started entering the workforce more and more. You can look at throughout the late Victorian era, the late 1800s into the early 1900s, women are constantly entering the workforce. But it's just what class of women are entering the workforce. Earlier on, the women of the lower classes who have to bring in money to eat, they're entering. Then you have, during the First World War and then the Second World War, the upper classes are coming into work. So, yeah, I mean, I guess on the face value, yes, it's starting to open up, and you see it more acceptable for women to enter.
Okay, so I think I'm going to tie that in with Juliet's question, which she asks, which it must have had a terrific effect, she thinks, because of course there are these large changes. Women are allowed to wear trousers for the first time, she says. But also we talk about the sort of women's land army. They're entering into manufacturing. How does that then tie in to discussions of bombing centered on gender? Does it have an influence, or do you think the fact we're now at war changes the way that the discourse is shaped is more significant?
I think it's well, you don't really see a lot. You still see the rhetoric focusing on, we have to save women and children. Women and children are different. If you look at other propaganda pamphlets such as Frontline and things printed during the Blitz, for example, they are focusing on the manliness of the ARP workers, but you also see them focusing on women. So it's weird. It's at the same time they're saying, yes, women, we need you to go out and work in the factories. We need you to farm, to produce these things. We need you to buck up and survive the Blitz. But at the same time, they're saying, no, we have to protect our women. These children are delicate. They can't. It's this weird dichotomy that on the one hand you have one argument, and on the other you have the other. So.
Okay, I think that's a nice point to start wrapping up, because I think that's what makes this topic so fascinating. It is that tension between the 2 points, and the way that it also feeds out into British society. Because this isn't just happening in one sphere, it's sort of the way you then read through this into other areas. So is that part of what you're doing? I'm looking forward to reading your research when I can, but I mean, is that what you're hoping to do, to read out from this into other areas?
Yeah. I definitely want to expand and look further into how the gender dynamic grew or decreased during the war and other areas as well. So.
Okay, brilliant. Well, Katie, before I wrap up and thank you, I think it's a good moment to answer the final question we have here, which is whether or not our research program will continue in 2022. It will. It will be virtual. We've already got one lecture on the books, which is with John Andreas Olsen, which we presented live from Wolverhampton. We'll also have a lecture, not next week, because I have a break, but the week after that, where we're broadcasting live from Lancaster. And we then have lectures for the next 6 weeks from that date up until the 10th of December, when James is presenting? No, James is presenting on the 3rd of December on a Friday. I know he's with us, so I want to plug his talk. He's presenting live from London. It will be broadcast the week after that. We should be presenting live from Cosford. So do join us on Crowdcaster. If you're local, come and visit us and see us for talks in person. But Katie, I just want to thank you again for a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. I thought you dealt with some tough questions from me in particular, actually, very well. So thank you very much, and best of luck with your thesis.
All right, thank you.
Good night, everybody.